everybody. Let's start this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to you all. If you've just joined, we've just started the webinar and we are recording this meeting. You are free to say hello and welcome everybody in the chat. The chat's being monitored. You can ask any questions throughout this webinar in the chat and have discussions as well. But this webinar will also have group work, and we're going to ask for a lot of active involvement of you today. So please, next slide. So you've joined WASH System Strengthening the Basics for USAID, Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance Implementing Partners. This is our second and final webinar today. Next slide, please. First, we'll start off with a little bit of a round of introductions, because we know that some of you maybe have only joined the second webinar and weren't able to join the first webinar last week and haven't enjoyed the online course. So we'll do a short introductions, then we're going to do a recap of sessions 1 to 6 of the online course, and then we're really going to go into lots of active engagement and discussions with you on, what does this all mean? How could you apply system strengthening, and how can these type of approaches be useful for you towards more impact? There's going to be lots of discussion and then next steps. So yes, go ahead, course facilitators. So we'll have several course facilitators have been involved over the last week. We have Brenda Agiro from Water for People and Laura Burns from Water for People that you've probably met on the online course or in the office hours. Then there is Samantha Wind from IRC, who you've probably also met in the first webinar as well. And she's kindly facilitating as well the Mentimeter today and this presentation. And then there's Ellen Walter of IRC, who you've probably met in the first webinar as well. She'll also be presenting one of her main areas of expertise is advocacy. And through the last week of your engagement with you, we've seen a lot of interest in using advocacy as part of your work. So she'll definitely talk about that in this webinar today. And then there's myself, Jeske Verhoeven. I also work from IRC. I'm based here in the Netherlands. So I'm joining from this afternoon to you. And I'll talk you through the first part of the webinar, and I'll also end up, and you've probably seen me as part of the office hours as well. So I lead the WASH Systems Academy at IRC. So first of all, let's start a little bit about, overview of participants. So at the moment, I drew this information an hour ago, so it's 1 hour old. An hour ago, we had 143 participants who started the online course, and they came from 27 different countries. At the moment, 47 certificates have already been awarded. And if I look at the average course grades, the people who are doing tests, there's 2 multiple choice tests in the course. If you pass both of them, you're able to download your own digital certificate of completion. The average course grade at the moment is 92%. So the people who are doing the online course and doing the tests are doing really well and showing a really good understanding of WASH system strengthening with a high average score of 92%. Just knowing as well that you have 1 more month to complete the online course and finish and download your certificate. So we of course understand that not all of you have been able to finish the whole course. There's still a month of time to do that, and we'll get more into that in the end as well on next steps. So next slide, please. So where do you live? So we saw 27 different countries. So what we're seeing is over 55% come from low and middle income countries, and 33% comes from low income countries. And a very small minority of 10% comes from high income to upper middle income countries. So really nice division there as well. And what's your working experience with regards to water, sanitation and hygiene? We see that 92% have between 0 and 5 years of work experience in water, sanitation, and hygiene. And that's also something I think we saw in the first webinar, that most of your expertise is in other areas than water, sanitation, and hygiene. So really nice to have been able to engage with lots of people where you're coming in from other different forms of expertise often. So really nice to have seen that as well. So next slide. So as part of the online course, there's also a feedback survey. We're actually going to share a real feedback survey next week as well by email for you to fill in, because we really like to know how you judge this online course so we can learn and improve as well continuously. But these are some of the initial reactions to the online course that we drew from that feedback form, which was filled in by 33 people. So what's your initial reactions to the course is that they're overall really positive, on a scale of 1 to 5 being 1, I strongly disagree, and 5, I really agree. I completely agree. We score 4.9 on I would recommend this course, a 4.6 on I learned something new, I found the content interesting, 4.7, the content motivated me to continue with the course, 4.7, the content was easy to understand, a 4.5, and the platform was easy to use, a 4.5, and I didn't have any technical problems, a 4.4 as well. And we were able to interact with some of you who were experiencing or having some questions as well in the office hours. So I'm really happy to see these first initial reactions. If you haven't filled this in yet, you'll be receiving a survey through email as well. But these are just a first snapshot of what we're seeing today. And of course, the course isn't over yet. This final webinar is very much part of it. Yeah, we want to hear from you. I'll hand over now to Laura.
Thank you, Jessica. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. Thank you very much for being here. So we want to hear a little bit more. Jessica shared some of our initial data, but we also know that not all of you maybe have been able to finish the course yet. So we're interested in hearing a little bit more from you all. So if we can go to the first question, we're hoping that you can share what are 2 to 3 first, we have to go to menti.com. That's menti, MENTI.com, and use the code 26973759. And I'm thinking that we'll put that in the chat as well, so that you can access that. So I'm going to hold just a minute or two for us to get everyone into that. So code is in the chat, and the site is menti, MENTI.com. And once you're in, you should be able to see this first question. What are 2 to 3 concepts from the class that you feel are most important for system strengthening? And if you can add those, and we'll see what you all think after going through the course, what you find to be most important for system strengthening. So see collaboration and building blocks, beyond WASH and financing. And we're of course waiting for others to join as well, but we see collective action here as well, related to collaboration, importance of institutions, systems thinking, monitoring. We have some more systems thinking or system thinking up there. Clearly building blocks are a critical component. They're the largest and the big and in the center of this graphic. We have understanding of SDGs and WASH service levels, water resources management, sanitation systems, policies. So a lot of different components that people feel are important for system strengthening. Looking at the integration of our work and roadmaps to really have a vision for the future. The importance of sustainable services and working both at the national and district level is important. Looking at the different actors in the system is seen as key. And strengthening systems again is appearing, and seeing it in a little bit different way, the WASH roadmap rather than just the roadmap. So a lot of different key components here for system strengthening as responses continue to come in. But clearly, some things that really are sticking out for me in this are the building blocks. So those 9 building blocks, which we'll review shortly, that are all interconnected and really important for strong systems. The importance of collective action, working together to strengthen systems because all actors are important. The building blocks are a mix of factors and actors, as is the WASH system. Monitoring is really seen as important. I see that really jumping out here, as well as the importance of financing. So we can move on to the next question, which is, what is one thing that you learned that you are looking forward to applying in your work that you learned during this course? And it's in the same surveys, so you don't have to add anything new if you're already in menti.com with that code. So looking to apply building blocks, looking to apply system strengthening in your context, road mapping, setting the vision for WASH services in a district, visioning, which is a key part of the roadmap process, applying WASH away from the home, so in public institutions, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, and public marketplaces, collaboration, videos and animation in the work, supporting systems and advocacy, and we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of advocacy coming up as well. I see monitoring. I see using the JMP website, which is part of monitoring. So a lot of different things that we have found to be important, which makes sense because we're a combination of different actors who might see our entry points differently depending on what our expertise is and what our organization works on, but the key being system strengthening and building blocks. All right, so I'm just going to really briefly, this was a really great opportunity to see what you all see as some of the most important concepts that we discussed in the course. And now we're just going to briefly run through any that we haven't seen up here on the board. So Samantha, if you don't mind, we'll go back to the presentation. But want to thank you all for participating in Mentimeter, and there will be a chance to do some more Mentimeters activities coming up. So we've hit a lot of these, so I'm not going to go point by point, but first of all, we talked about the importance of a WASH system. So all of the different actors and factors and how they relate, and needing to strengthen that whole system in order to achieve SDG 6. And that a key part of that are those 9 building blocks, which we'll look at more closely later, of sustainable WASH systems that we need to assess and then address. And that addressing of building blocks is really a progressive and iterative process. And something that we talked about in the first webinar is that we really need to, we really can't address all 9 building blocks at once. That would be too difficult. And so we need to focus on certain building blocks as entry points, especially in the context in which we all work, which might be more fragile or rural. And so we should start with a few and then build out and connect to other building blocks. And hopefully that doesn't seem quite so overwhelming. All right, next slide, please. Now, a couple other key points is that there's always a system that can be strengthened. No matter the context in which we're working, there is some system there that we should be linking to and working to strengthen. And one way of doing that is collective actions of all actors so that we can really create a holistic vision for improving WASH services using a strong WASH system. And monitoring is really a key component of system strengthening. So we saw that in the responses that a lot saw monitoring, and that joint monitoring program data is really key for understanding and strengthening systems. And at the end of all of this, WASH system strengthening is really about ensuring equitable access to services. And in order to have equitable access, it requires different approaches in different contexts. And so that's what we'll be excited about hearing from all of you, and what we already heard from some of you in the course is how your context relate, or how you can apply system strengthening in your context. So if we go to the next slide, throughout the course, there were a lot of opportunities to connect and create through discussion boards and presentations. And so we wanted to highlight some of the main themes we saw on those discussion boards and the presentations and how they relate to system strengthening. So at the beginning of the course, we asked to reach SDG 6, where do we start? And really some of the key points that we saw was that advocacy is important for donors and governments, and we'll talk more about that later, and that advocacy could be for including full project cycles or for getting the buy-in from different actors like the local government and national government. We saw themes about involving users in the planning of operation and maintenance of WASH facilities. And we really saw that it's important to understand where we are in the system, to map the system, understand that there's a system there, and then understand where we interact in that system. There was a lot of discussion about the importance of working both locally and nationally. And later on, we'll look at what some of the challenges can be related to that, and then creating buy-in with all stakeholders. So we want to share a few key quotes that we pulled from the discussion sessions when talking about SDG 6, which is of course universal access for all by 2030 to WASH services. And Susan shared that it is difficult to say where to start. I think it depends first of all understanding where we are. So thinking about monitoring and assessing service levels, building blocks, and the whole system. And Florence shared that we need to start by ensuring that development partners design WASH strategies that comprehensively accommodate sustainability and should be implemented by the national and local systems to improve WASH service delivery. So thinking through different policies, and then again, thinking through the connection between local and national systems to deliver sustainable WASH services. And then Volanarioso shared, we need to start by wearing the lenses of system approach and in wearing the hat of a facilitator of that process. I really like this. So thinking about system strengthening and how we can serve as facilitators in this process. We don't have to, and we shouldn't be the only individuals pushing this forward. We should be facilitating the participation of all actors within the system. So thinking further about what our roles can be in system strengthening and in the WASH system, we asked what roles you saw for yourselves in the WASH system. And we saw that some of you thought that you were change agents. Others, similar to the previous quote, saw yourselves as facilitators or capacity builders or documenters that are there to share lessons learned. We saw others see yourselves as partnership builders to get buy-in from others and ensure all stakeholders have a shared vision or common agenda. And then we saw others seeing themselves as planners and really working on developing perhaps the roadmaps and then the individual plans required to reach sustainable WASH services. And so a few quotes we thought that were particularly salient or particularly strong for these points, which were, my role is to be a change agent, to share WASH strengthening approach to my colleagues, friends, and other concerned stakeholders, to review our WASH program accordingly. And that was from Kumar. And I really am excited to see that Kumar sees himself as now a person that can share this vision and mission with others and really be a change agent both in the community and the wider system in which you are working. And Diana shared, my role is to advocate for systems thinking in the planning, execution, and delivery of WASH services, to move beyond the infrastructure and a few other building blocks I have been focused on, and start thinking holistically about the whole system. So really seeing how Diana currently engages with building blocks and thinking how she can connect herself to other building blocks in the system to move away from pure infrastructure provision to think about the sustainability and other components to strengthen WASH systems. And then we asked a question as we thought more and more about wash service provision, and not just the provision of water services, but also sanitation and hygiene. And we asked a question saying, do you think that wash services outside of homes are important? And we saw in a lot of the responses that individuals were saying that there has been a large focus on wash services at the household, but perhaps not as much focus on provision of wash services at a clinic or a school or perhaps a marketplace. And the common theme in responses was that it's especially important to consider these services outside of the house, given how much time individuals now spend away from home. So it wouldn't be sufficient to just have water and sanitation provision in a home, but instead we need to ensure that individuals have access to services everywhere they go in a community. And others said that this is a really important entry point. So working perhaps in schools or clinics is a really good point for facilitating behavior change. It's a great place for that to happen because we're already bringing people together and sharing information about health and nutrition at clinics, or in schools, we're already imparting knowledge to students. And so behavior change can be a critical component of that. And then those behaviors can be carried home. And also individuals shared that when we're thinking about the provision of water, sanitation, and hygiene services outside of the home, we also need to think about different management models for those services. So how we're managing services at a household may look a little different than how we manage it at public institutions. And a few strong quotes for this is that the world is in an era where no one is at home during the day. Therefore, using institutions such as schools, health facilities, workplaces for both formal and informal workers like marketplaces could be better placed for wash systems entry points. This could not only bring about sustainability, but also mindset change for health behaviors. And that's Godfrey kind of summarizing some of those previous points that I've mentioned. And Josh shared, if we want to strengthen wash systems and achieve the full ambitions of SDG 6, we need to create sustainable services for wash everywhere that people live, work, and play. That means in households, as well as healthcare facilities, schools, and other communal places. And part of achieving those wash services in all locations and sustainable services is thinking about the roadmap for wash services. So when thinking about that roadmap, a few things that popped up over and over in the discussion was that it is critical for developing a shared vision for achieving universal services, but also that it's not that easy to implement, that it is going to take time, that it's not just an activity that can be done in a week and crossed off a checklist, but instead that it will take time to implement and to involve all stakeholders in the wash system in the development. And because we're trying to involve all stakeholders, several of you mentioned that it will be challenging to get buy-in from the government, and that it will be a large financial and time commitment, which is in fact true. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. But Omid shared, when thinking about the roadmap, that the roadmap is very useful. However, it will take years to implement it and ensure it is functioning well, addressing all issues. This has to start at early recovery phases for countries that have witnessed an emergency. For my context in Iraq, I think there is a large room for using it, as in some aspects, there are high similarities with the case study in Ghana. And what I was excited about this particularly, and what we found really exciting about this, is that in thinking about how roadmaps can be critical shortly following an emergency or in a fragile or vulnerable country, that roadmaps are still really important, and that yes, it will be difficult, yes, it will take time, but that we can start to build it early on to make sure that there's sustainable services. And if you're wondering more about how to do that, I'd really point you, as Omi did in his quote as well, to the case study of Ghana in the Wash Systems Academy. And we'll also be talking about more about this in the next couple of slides. And Sunit also shared that the roadmap is a useful tool for me to articulate a clear change process from visioning to implementation and monitoring and institutional strengthening for overall WASH system. So the roadmap is really providing the clear picture of where we need to go to improve WASH services. And I also wanted to share this quote from Chiranjeevi, which is a little long, but I think it really incorporates many aspects that we saw coming up as themes in the discussion. And that is, I've been using some of the concepts and building blocks in my regular WASH sector programs. However, I am seeing some challenges in applying this tool in fragile states. Getting initial buy-in and leadership of the state authority could potentially be a challenge, not only from a capacity perspective, but also from the urgency to deliver humanitarian services to the target group. I also believe that some sort of buy-in of the approach at the national level would be critical in using such tools at the subnational levels. I intend to engage at the national level initially so that there are some champions within the government system who would be happy to pilot this tool at a district or government level. So really thinking about the importance of the tool, but also recognizing that there will be challenges, especially in fragile states where perhaps the government isn't as strong, and that we really need to be working at the national level in order to create buy-in at the local level as well. But we can also work at the reverse. We can work locally and demonstrate success locally to get buy-in at the national level as well. So when thinking about entry points for developing a roadmap and for thinking about entry points for strengthening systems, themes we saw in discussion were that a paradigm shift is required. So moving from these short-term projects where we're working in silos and not connecting to actors needs to stop. And instead, we need to consider more of the system strengthening approach. The roadmap development was seen as a really important entry point for our work, going through that visioning process to really establish the plan for achieving universal WASH services. And then we also saw that in order for this to be effective, collective action was required. And so thinking about these entry points, Edson shared, to create WASH systems that work in my country, Zimbabwe, it is imperative that all actors are prepared to change the way we have been doing business and adopt a system strengthening approach. Currently, the greater focus has been on infrastructure repair and establishment of new ones. Little or no regard or attention has been paid to the whole system as one intertwined web or chain. As a starting point, therefore, it is imperative that the systems thinking is shared and adopted by the various WASH actors. This is a mammoth task that needs government to play its part, but someone has to engage with government at that very high level. And Edson's quote continued to talk about those challenges of engaging government at the highest level as well as at the local level. So I really encourage you all to take a look and sign in to the WASH Systems Academy again, especially if you were someone that completed the course earlier on, because there's a really lively discussion happening on these different connect activities throughout the 6 sessions in talking about good entry points, challenges of system strengthening, talking about WASH away from homes, talking about the key components of SDG 6 and where we should start, and then also thinking about our role in the systems. So we were only able to highlight a few comments from participants, but we certainly encourage you to sign back into the Academy and to look at the different connect and create activities to see what your colleagues are saying about this work and to continue the discussion there. So
Laura,
There was
sorry to interrupt. There is a hand raised from Habib, and we don't have time for lots of questions, and there's some good discussion in the chat. But because Habib raised his hand, maybe we can have a quick question there, and then we can move on to the next section.
That's great. Thank you, Ellen and Habib. If you would, I've unmuted you, or I've asked you to unmute in case you would like to ask your question. Habib, do you have a question?
No.
Okay, Laura, we'll just continue on. Sorry, we'll keep going forward, and please, again, if you have questions or comments, please enter them in the chat. We've got some good discussion going there. So thanks, Laura, on to you.
Great, thank you, Ellen. So the roadmap, there was a lot of discussion of the roadmap in the previous comments, and just wanted to share this as we think about how we can apply system strengthening in your context, thinking through the different steps of the roadmap: introduction and visioning, institutional strengthening, the different assessments of cost, water resources, and service levels, district planning, and implementation and monitoring. So when we think about applying system strengthening in your context, we want to hear from you. So Samantha, if you can share the Mentimeter again.
Laura, there was one question on the roadmap in the chat that maybe is not so nice to address while people are switching, is, what's the difference between a plan and a roadmap?
Sure. Jessica, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take it?
No, I already added in the chat, but please go ahead.
Great. So a roadmap is similar to a plan, and it's basically a large scale, large vision for the district of how services will be achieved. It is multi-year. It is looking at the financing as well as the narrative plan. And a plan is often an annual plan, but it could also be, you could consider a district water and sanitation plan could be considered multi-annual, which would also be a roadmap. So it's just a different term, but the key to a roadmap or a key to a multi-annual plan is that really it's looking at long-term, setting a long-term and medium-term vision for how improved wash services will be implemented in the district. But if any of my colleagues want to jump in as well, I see Ellen, you've unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that often the roadmap is viewed as more of a process document. It helps to guide you through creating a plan. So the roadmap is kind of that longer term, that vision that you have, and it encompasses all of those different aspects of the process that get you to plans to implement system strengthening. So the roadmap is more of the guide, and the plans, as Laura said, are more kind of action-oriented, annual, or even multi-year, kind of the concrete actions that you might take to get you to strengthen the system.
Thank you, Ellen. So now, as we think about how to implement system strengthening in your context, we're going to ask you to go to menti.com again and respond to the question. Use a few words to define the context in which you work. So perhaps government is weak, or you're working in a really rural environment, or you are in a very climate challenged region, or water scarce. So if you can add a few comments about your context that we can be considering when we're thinking about how to apply system strengthening in your context, that would be great. So we have some responses coming in: overwhelmingly rural, a lot of farming livelihoods, dry corridors in some areas, resource poor, and in differing from dry, we have flood prone areas, urban slum, humanitarian, disaster-prone areas, resource poor, where there's a weak government or a weak capacity, looking at working with vulnerable people or those living in poverty, working with those with disabilities. Some are in the river basin or rural growth centers. So a lot of different contexts. And I think that is what's important to remember, is that no matter the context, system strengthening can be done, but it just needs to be tailored for that context. You can also see that people are working in a context with a lot of NGOs and donor finance, where boreholes are the main source of water. So you can keep thinking about your context, and we'll go back to the presentation, but it's important to have that understanding of what your context is when thinking about how to apply this work. So we've already heard a lot of these different contexts, and I'll just highlight that something that I didn't necessarily see on the slide, but I think happens as a result of some of the contexts that were shared, is that we can be working in a really short-term project focus rather than a long-term. And that has an impact on the 9 building blocks of sustainable wash systems. So I will not go through, if you don't mind going to the next slide, I will not go through the full 9 building blocks. That's what the course is for. But remember these 9 building blocks, and think about, if you're working in a really fragile context, there will be very strong impacts on these 9 building blocks. So if we go to the next slide, it's not surprising that there will be themes that we see in how the building blocks are impacted by the context in which you work. So in a really fragile and weak government setting, we can see that there will be silos in the work. There will often be short-term program focus and projectized ad hoc work. There will be limited government leadership that has an impact in planning, regulation, water resources management. So this slide here really shows the different impacts that a fragile environment can have on the 9 building blocks. Here, there are 8 listed, and that's simply because of different organizations seeing different building blocks differently. But you can see that there is a strong impact that fragile environments, so that could be a weak government or an area prone by humanitarian or environmental challenges, very rural environments, that there are definitely impacts on the building blocks, and that we need to work to respond to those building blocks. So institutional arrangements and coordination, there's often low capacity of the actors. In service delivery, there's often very supply-driven work that undermines market actors, and the asset management. So management of infrastructure can be a little bit chaotic. In monitoring, it's often ad hoc or needs-based rather than a routine annual process looking at service level monitoring. Planning is often siloed, and so it's happening with one actor and another actor is separately planning, so there can be duplication of work. We can also see that finance is often short-term, or users are less willing to pay because of economic crises or a fragile government or lack of funds. Regulation and accountability is challenged with those same silos that we talked about between different actors. Water resources management can just be that water is scarce and climate change is a challenge, but it can also be that the governments and regulation is not there for water sources. And learning and adaptation can be challenged because there's a high staff turnover, or organizations come into an area and leave, and so there's not a lot of coordination. So this is just some of the ways that the different contexts that you described when we were doing the Mentimeter activity can have an impact on your work. So Now that you have a better understanding of building blocks, we're going to ask another question on Mentimeter that we actually asked at the beginning of this course. And that was, which of the building blocks is weakest in your context? So now that you've had a chance to go through the course, and now that you've had a chance to think through some of the challenges that your context may pose for system strengthening, what do you think are some of the weakest building blocks in your context? And to respond to this, you just go to menti.com again, and that code is 26973759. So right now, we have a spread of policy, institutions, and regulation and accountability. For some, monitoring, but regulation and accountability is seen really as the weakest right now. I see a response coming in the chat, monitoring as well. Policy and legislation is right up there with regulation and accountability, which makes sense because sometimes that requires working at the same level to promote policies as well as regulatory frameworks. Institutions, so strengthening those institutions, and finance are seen as challenges as well. Learning and adaptation is now seen as a challenge. But finance is now in lead with regulation and accountability as where the sources of finance, especially if we're looking at collecting tariffs from users in a really vulnerable context or a really resource scarce context, that can be difficult. I'm seeing some more comments in the chat for policy and legislation and regulation and accountability. So while there is a spread between what we see as some of the weakest building blocks, which makes sense because all of our contexts are different, we do see a few key themes like regulation and accountability, finance, and policy and legislation. And I would lump monitoring with that as well. And I think what's interesting when we think about that is those are things that are very difficult for one single organization to control. And that's why we see them as challenges, because they really require the work of many actors in the system, which means that we as practitioners need to really connect with other actors, and we need to work both locally and nationally to strengthen those building blocks. So we don't just want to focus on the challenges, though. We also are interested in hearing from you on what you think are some of the strongest building blocks in your context, because those strengths are going to be key entry points for our work. So I'll give it a minute for people to respond to this question of what are some of the strongest building blocks in your context. Infrastructure for now is taking the lead. In the chat, Nicholas shared planning. Others are saying learning and adaptation. And what's really interesting is to see right now that some are saying that policy and legislation is one of the strongest in their context, since we just saw that as a challenge in the previous slide, which highlights the importance of connecting to colleagues and learning from colleagues and adapting our approach based on what other colleagues are doing that have been successful.
Laura, if I could just jump in for 1 second. Yeah. I think it's interesting around policy and legislation. One of the things that came up was that oftentimes the actual policies and the legislation are there, but the challenge related to the system is the implementation of those policies, particularly in the context in which a lot of the participants are working, or from national to local level. So I find it actually not that uncommon that both an area that people might want to focus on is policy and legislation, as well as it being a strong area, because policies and legislation often at national level can be very strong and have the right language, but when it comes to the implementation or the accountability associated with them, that's where you see the challenge related to the system. So it's interesting to see that.
Thanks, Ellen, that is great. So infrastructure is far and away the leader right now, and we see that some of these other areas, planning, institutions, finance, regulation, water resources management, and learning and adaptation are not quite as strong. But it's important to keep in mind these strengths of ours as our entry points for our work. So we'll go back to the PowerPoint presentation, and thanks again, Samantha. I know it's a lot of jumping back and forth. Yeah. And thank you.
Yeah, I also think there's one interesting question in the chat that you might want to respond to, because as you were talking about entry points, somebody also asked, so how do building blocks and system strengthening actually work with other approaches that people are probably applying, like CLTS and FAST or market-based sanitation, that people might be wondering about. So maybe this is also a good opportunity to also discuss that a little bit.
Sure, great. I'm going to look specifically for that question.
Yeah, I can read it to you.
Sure.
It was by Santos. And how can we align with building blocks and different models, as for example, CLTS and FAST? So it was by Santos Data asking this. And I think probably maybe more people I've experienced are wondering these type of things.
Yeah, so I would say that those specific approaches to providing services can be linked to building blocks. So those approaches are ways to address the different building blocks and can be used to address the different weak parts of a system. So those are ways that we can strengthen building blocks and ways that we can provide services. And so they're really key to the way we do our work. And if they're really strong, if we're doing well in those components, those can be a way that we connect to different actors and strengthen the system. So if you're doing CLTS for sanitation work, your sanitation work involves working closely with different communities and local leaders. So those local leaders can be engaged perhaps in monitoring of sanitation services. And those local leaders can be engaged further for pushing the importance of paying for wash services. So there's different ways that you can use those activities to both strengthen the work that's already being done, but to branch out into other work as well. And I'll pause in case any of my other colleagues want to add. All right, so then we'll move on to thinking now about those opportunities. So first, I want to highlight that we understand that the context in which you're all working is challenging. But there's good news too. And one of those pieces is that there is a shifting focus. So earlier, somebody asked, we talked about the paradigm shift that's required to achieve SDG 6. And the good news is we're seeing that. Donors and other organizations are starting to apply system strengthening. So we should really work to align with them and promote the shift. And especially because donors and other organizations are shifting the way they work, governments may be more likely to support this focus because that's where the money is moving. And one example of the way that the sector is shifting is USAID's local systems framework for supporting sustainable development, which you can see here on the right side of the slide. And so if we go to the next slide, what we saw as some of the context in which you work was a weaker government, which of course means a weaker service authority, which is the body that's responsible for the overall regulation of a system and water services in a district. And so that means that we need to look at other actors in the system to strengthen if the service authorities are going to be weak. We should, of course, continue to work to strengthen the service authorities, but when you're in a really difficult context where the government is just not there, where the district government, there's not a lot of buy-in, then we can still work on system strengthening. And there we can work to strengthen service providers as well as the private sector. So service providers are the individuals that are responsible for the day-to-day management and provision of WASH services. And so we really need to make sure that if the service authority that is typically overseeing them and providing some sort of management structure for the service providers, if the service authority is not there, then the service provider is even more important. So if we go to the next slide, there's different ways that we can strengthen service providers. We can modify the service delivery models through things like cluster management or umbrella organizations that can share learnings and professionalize management. We can increase financial autonomy by decreasing non-revenue water through more effective billing systems, or by implementing technology that has lower operational costs, like solar pumps. And we can adapt regulatory agreements. So use the existing structures at the local level for monitoring or regulation. So if the local leaders in a community are really strong, work with them for monitoring. If the water user committee is really strong, they can be involved in monitoring or regulation. And those umbrella organizations, so, organizations that are overseeing service providers can be really important and can work outside of service authorities if necessary. Of course, we don't want to completely stop focusing on strengthening the government. We should always be working to strengthen the government. But in environments where that is a continual challenge, we can also be working on strengthening the service provider. And this capacity building with service providers should really also focus on increasing resilience so that the service providers can respond to economic, natural, any type of challenge they're faced, because we've really built their resilience. In areas where the government is not as strong, the private sector is also really important. If there's limited public services, the private sector is going to be fundamental to water and sanitation. So we really need to work to strengthen and formalize the private sector. And this should be done through a combination of business development support and technical training. And finally, in some of the contexts in which we work, there's a really strong humanitarian system there that's responding to different crises. And so we need to work, ensure that we are not just working with our WASH system, but we're also connecting to the humanitarian system, the education, and the health system to coordinate our efforts. And so we really need to move away from this parallel work where WASH practitioners are doing some work, humanitarian actors are doing different work, and we really need to combine our work and move away from that short-term focus to look at the long-term, to use the roadmap to achieve the sustainable services. And this is just a reminder that systems are all around us and they're all interconnected, and we need to make sure that we're working with all of those systems, especially when we're in especially challenging environments. And now,
can you go back one slide, because there was a great question in the chat from Rafa that said, what would you do in very remote areas without the presence of a state actor or any private sector? And I think that this is a great question that links to kind of how you can work with the humanitarian sector and strengthen that. And I would also add that even if what we would call more a traditional system isn't in place, there is often a system in place that maybe there's an opportunity to strengthen that system, even if it's not a more formal government system, that there's still aspects of the system strengthening model that could be applied even when those main actors aren't present. And there was a link, and maybe Jeske, you can put that link back in again, for system strengthening in fragile context. There was a great paper that was done by partners under Agenda for Change that talks specifically, Rafa, about that context and how can you apply system strengthening in very rural or fragile contexts where those types of actors that are often what we point to for needing to improve the system are absent. There's some really great case studies in there that I think will help at least start you thinking about how that could be applied. So Laura, sorry, I didn't mean to derail, but just wanted to mention that because that was a really great question. There's some other great questions that we'll come back to that are in the chat, and maybe people can just continue to respond to that while I talk about advocacy. But Samantha, next slide, thanks. So advocacy and influencing was something that came up quite frequently in the different aspects of the discussions that were happening throughout the course. And so what I wanted to do was just give a little bit of an overview and then really point you in the direction of another WASH Systems Academy course that I think you would find really useful that talks specifically about advocacy. So there's an opportunity to influence system strengthening actors and the process. And so advocacy is really important to the system strengthening approach. For advocacy and influencing, there's two kind of key questions that you're trying to answer. One is, what is the change that you want to see? And who has the power to make that change? And a lot of the system strengthening analysis and the tools that are associated with the roadmap identify those things. They identify where the system is weak and where there are opportunities potentially to engage. And it identifies the actors or the people involved in that. But when you're looking from an advocacy perspective, you want to look specifically at power. Where does the power sit, both formal and informal power? So who is making those decisions about the system, and how can you influence those people? And there's a lot of different approaches that you can take. There are campaigns, which are more maybe national level. We worked on a program called Watershed, which included a lot of really interesting perspectives and interesting approaches, like using local media or radio stations to get both to link basically through an advocacy lens, those who have power with those who are often viewed as powerless, or those who are marginalized populations, and getting the voices, bringing those voices together. So there's lots and lots of opportunities, you know, everything from using the data and the evidence and the information that you get from monitoring, using that as a way to influence as well. So the important thing I want to stress, though, is that you want to plan for advocacy just as you would any other programmatic work. And you want to make sure that the work that you're doing from an advocacy or influencing perspective is built on the work that you're doing from a programmatic perspective to address the building blocks. So they should complement each other. They should build on each other, and advocacy can enhance that. So the same way you would set programmatic goals and objectives, you want to set advocacy goals and objectives, making a plan for who to target and how to target them, and making sure that you're using the evidence that you have, either national data or data that you collected, and using that evidence and creating messages, and then identifying the best ways to deliver them, because the messenger or who delivers the message is also important. So that's just a very quick snapshot, but we do have an online course as part of the WASH Systems Academy. And since you are all experts in how to navigate through the Academy and through the courses, there's a course specifically on advocacy that I think will help answer a lot of your questions. So I'm going to leave it at that. Feel free to continue to put questions and comments related to advocacy or anything else in the chat. But Laura, I'm going to turn back to you.
Great, thank you, Ellen. So really thinking about how we can put all of this into practice, we need to, if we go to the next slide, first, understand your context and your system. We've already said before, but even in fragile settings, those systems exist and we need to understand them. And then we need to understand what influences the strength of the system. So in session 3, we introduced the building block analysis tool to really help It's a tool that can be used to assess the strength of the building blocks in your context. And that's a really great place to start when thinking about system strengthening. And if we go to the next slide, we should start by applying components of system strengthening. It can't all be done at the same time, and we can progressively work on different components at different levels. And we should think about specific entry points for strengthening the system. Where have you found success in the past? What specific actors have been your biggest champions? Because they will be your entry points. And as Ellen just mentioned, they are the ones that you want to continue to influence moving forward. So now that you've had a little bit of time to think about your context, we've had a lot of lively discussion in the chat, but we want to make sure that there's an opportunity for more discussion in breakout rooms. So in groups, which we'll be breaking you into in a few minutes, we are going to ask you to describe the context in which you work and explain what you think are the top 2 entry points for strengthening systems, or for strengthening systems in your context that you can apply and why you think they are. And we're going to ask, depending on time, we might ask you all to share this in the chat after we come back to the large group, so that we can share that out at the end of this session as different ways that you can apply system strengthening. So I am going to create these breakout rooms. Now, okay, so again, we'll ask you to go into breakout rooms. You'll have about 15 minutes. I'll send messages to your breakout rooms with these specific questions, and I'll also be sending time checks. But we are asking you to, in the context in which you work, please explain to the others in your group your context and what you think are the top 2 entry points for system strengthening that you can apply in your work. And we will all come back in about 15 minutes. So you're all going to be moved into these breakout rooms right about now.
If you are having any problems accessing the breakout rooms, I see that most people are now joining. There is on the bottom of your screen, there are these 3 dots with more. If you click on that, that also allows you to join one of the breakout rooms yourself, if you didn't click on the pop-up when it said breakout room. So let us know in the chat if you have any problems joining the breakout rooms, and we will help you to one of them. But I see more people are now joining the breakout rooms. So the idea now is to join one of the breakout rooms so you can have a discussion with others on your context. Laura is putting the questions for the breakout room as well in the breakout room. So I still see there's some people left in this webinar. Please go to one of the breakout rooms. There's 3 little dots on the bottom of your screen that say more. If you click those dots and you click on the word more, it will say join breakout room. If you click on that, you'll automatically be sorted to a breakout room where you can have a discussion with others on your context. And then after 15 minutes, we will transfer you back into this main session. So if you haven't joined one of the breakout rooms and you need help, let us know in the chat, or just click more, the word more on the bottom right of your screen. Then this word join breakout room will pop up, which allows you to join one of the breakout rooms and have a discussion. So I'll repeat one more time. It is the idea now that everybody joins a breakout room to have discussions on their own context. If you're still part of this meeting and you would like to join one of the breakout rooms, which we'll do for the next 15 minutes, then click on the word more on the bottom right of your screen. If you click on that, it will say join breakout room. You click on join breakout room and you're being automatically transferred to one of the breakout rooms where you can then have a discussion with your colleagues and then come back in 15 minutes to us, where we'll then reflect on your thoughts. Any questions? Always available in the chat, of course.
And for those that are still in this room, we could ask the same question in case you are having issues joining the breakout rooms. If you want to explain the context in which you work and what you think are the top 2 entry points for system strengthening, you could share that here with the colleagues that have stayed behind in this room if you are unable to get to a breakout room.
So if you're in this meeting, still at the moment, most participants are in breakout rooms discussing what their top two entry points are of WASH system strengthening in their context. If you still want to join them, if you click on the bottom of your screen, you see 3 little dots appear with the word more. If you click on the word more on the bottom right of your screen, a word join breakout room will appear. If you click on that, you're automatically going to one of the breakout rooms to join the discussion. You're also free to unmute yourself and share your thoughts in this meeting or put them in the chat. And Laura and I are still in this meeting to facilitate if needed. The other participants will join us in about 10 minutes. So there's still time for you to join one of the breakout rooms and share your thoughts with your colleagues. And then return to this larger webinar. And Laura, do you want to push maybe the questions one more time? And saying 10 more minutes, I think, or?
Yaska, would you please put the question in the chat box?
Yes, sure. I'll mention the question now and also put it in the chat box for you. So the question to everybody is, if you think about your own context, what are the 2 entry points that you can think of system strengthening? And also put it in the chat right now.
Thank you.
Laura, that's correct, right?
Yes. And if you would like to be moved to a room, please let us know and we can move you there if you dropped out of a room.
Please return me to the room. I was in room 8. I left just to get back to you. Get me back to room 8.
Okay, we will work on that.
Yeah, so Laura will move you to room 8 again. And the question is, please reflect on the 2 entry points for system strengthening for your context.
Sorry, I'm just having a little bit of issues getting you back into that room for some reason.
But else you can also share your reflections with me. Because I think there's about 5 minutes left, right, Laura?
Yes, so I think I might have just been successful in reassigning to room 8.
Yeah, I don't see her anymore as participants. Yeah, so that's great. Well done.
So I'm going to send a message of 5 minutes.
Because then there's still time to do a wrap up, discuss some of the results after.
Great.
So I think it's time to pull people back. What do you think, Laura? Because there's maybe 1 minute more, tell people 1 more minute.
Just sent the wrapping up message out. So All right, closing the rooms now.
Okay, great.
Welcome back to those that are starting to come back into the room. We ask that as you come back into the room, you add any highlights from your discussion in the chat box, or any key learnings from your discussion that we'll be able to very briefly discuss as we wrap up the course. So we'll just give it a few more minutes as everyone comes back into the discussion. But again, please add any key points that you discussed in your group to the chat, and we will briefly summarize before wrapping up today's discussion.
As I think almost everybody's back into this meeting, I'll just echo the words of Laura. Welcome back. After your discussions, please share your key insights into the chat so Laura can read some of them out and make sense of them. So welcome back. We're into the final part of this webinar, and we're asking you to share some of the key thoughts of your group discussions into the chat so we can discuss them in this webinar.
All right, so far I'm seeing the importance of finance and monitoring and regulation and accountability, planning, financing. In our group, we looked at using learning and existing institutions as entry points, which is great. We're really seeing a lot of the finance and monitoring to understand where we're at and what we need to work on and further strengthen within the system. Community engagement, I see here, to really assess knowledge in communities for advocacy and how communities can work together as a good entry point. Collaboration is key, working with different stakeholders. So there's a lot of great answers coming in. I'm really happy to see a lot of this advocacy and visioning process. So I'm actually going to pass it over to Jessica now to talk about next points, but we will be sharing and compiling all of this information about good entry points to share with you all following the webinar. So please continue to add them here in the chat so that we'll be able to share that with you all following the webinar.
Okay, so thanks, Laura, for that. So it's time now almost to wrap up this course and this final webinar. So what are some of the next steps while you keep on adding these insights into the chat? And as Laura said, we're going to store them all and make them available as part of the online course. So next slide, please. So before we end up with some words of end words by Nicole of USAID Pro WASH. So what are some of the next steps? You know, start applying WASH system strengthening in your work. You know, there's so many different ways to start, and always remember, system strengthening it's a mindset. It's a way of looking at the world. It's something. It's looking at the world from a holistic perspective, which in that sense you can always apply, and it's a continuous activity that you can always do, and there's no point and a point and stop towards that. So, you know, start applying system strengthening in your work. We will be sharing a feedback survey because we really like to know how you've enjoyed this course and if there's anything that we could learn from. The survey will be shared with you by email next week on Monday, the 2nd of August. You have until the 31st of August to complete the course and receive your certificate. So if you haven't been able to complete the course, there's still time. The course is 8 hours online and you have a whole month of August to do this. The webinar 1, if you weren't able to participate in webinar 1, is stored under the course resources, and this webinar that we also record with all these comments will also be made available under the course resources. If you have any questions going forward, you can always email IRC at training@ircwash.org, and we will try to respond to your questions as soon as possible. So there's still opportunities to engage, to finish the course, and to ask any questions after this point as well. Your account on the WASH Systems Academy will remain active for the next 6 months, so you can download or access your course materials if you like. The WASH Systems Academy offers more free courses, and I saw that lots of people were mentioning finance as well. So actually we are launching a new finance course at the end of August. It's on the 23rd of August. The information on this course is in the chat now too, so you can also pre-register, for example, for the finance course and join that. That's a self-paced, self-guided course of 16 hours, specifically focused on how do you strengthen this building block finance. So if you're interested in that, that's another way that you can get and engage after this course. You know, the WASH Systems Academy at the moment provides 7 free courses, and in the next couple of months we'll be launching 4 more. So follow us on that as well. And then I'd like to thank you from my perspective, from the team of IRC and Water for People. We really enjoyed engaging with you and your active participation. We hope to be meeting one day, maybe face to face, or else to seeing you online. And now let me hand over to Nicole Weber for some concluding remarks.
Thank you so much. I want to take a moment and thank all of the participants today. It's great
Nicole,
to see
could you turn up your sound a bit? Because for me, you're very your sound is a little bit soft.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, slightly. Yes, okay. Please.
My apologies. There were some storms, and I think it has affected the internet. So I'm going to turn off my camera. But I want to thank everyone for your participation. It's been great to see, over 100 people enrolled in the course. Many of you have already completed all of the work and received a certificate. So for those of you who haven't quite gotten through all the content, I really encourage you to take the time to complete it within the next month. We're also very excited to be able to offer some one-on-one technical support and coaching with our partnership with IRC and Water for People. So if you are a Title II funded resilience food security activity, or you receive CDF funding from USAID, we will be reaching out to you specifically next week and tell you a little bit more information on how you can apply for this support. This support will be for resilience food security activities that have at least 24 months remaining, and it will be an occasion to work one-on-one over several months. If you don't have Title II or CDF funding, again, we really encourage you to check out the other resources that are available on the WASH Systems Academy. And we will also be, through Poor WASH, offering some other online events related to this topic over the coming months. So I want to thank everyone again. I really want to thank IRC, Water for People, and all of you for your participation. Thanks for a great facilitator team. Thanks to those partners who presented during the opening webinar. I'm really excited to see all of this work coming together. And as you know, systems approach really requires all of us working together. So the more critical mass we can get to be trained in systems thinking, more of us that can apply it in our work, it'll really make for a stronger WASH sector. In the end, also, I want to just encourage you, if you have French-speaking colleagues, we will be repeating this training in September. We're going to start outreach and promotion soon, but I'd encourage you to get as many of your French colleagues to sign up for that. So thanks so much, and looking forward to seeing you in other trainings or in other online activities.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for those ending words. I saw in the chat the remark, is this webinar recorded? Yes, we recorded this webinar. We'll store it and make it available the next few days on the WASH Systems Academy on the online course as part of the course resources tab. So you'll still be able to listen to this whole recording of this webinar. We'll add all the slides there, and we'll also consolidate some of the comments in the chat there, so you can access that as well. So you have another month to complete the course and earn a certificate. And there's maybe some of my colleagues can also drop the email address in the chat to training@ircwatch.org. So if you have any questions following this course, you know, we're still here. And we also want to thank you for your participation. We've greatly enjoyed it, and we hope to meet you again online, or who knows, one day face to face. So there's still time to complete the course. Thank you, and we'll be saying goodbye from here. And good day, good morning, good afternoon. We wish you a very pleasant day wherever you are.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all the facilitators and participants. Thank you
Thank you.
all from Bangladesh for your nice facilitation. Actually, we enjoyed this training. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the kind words.
Everything. Bye.
Bye-bye, Luis Nacho.